Hi, my name is Doron Pinhas. I'm the CTO with Continuity Software, and I'm happy to share with you today's presentation. Let me just share the screen really quickly. Awesome. Taking a quick look at the slide presentation, I see that the marketing team has taken initiative. So let's ignore the title, but in today's session, what we'll try to do is to briefly visit the role of storage and backup given the modern threat landscape, and then analyze some of the most current threats in that landscape and see and check whether they are relevant to storage and how. We'll revisit the state of storage security as a whole, industry-wide, and try to see if this applies to you and what lessons we can learn, trying to provide some examples. And following that analysis, we'll go on and discuss what it is that you can do to build a better storage security posture management program, provide you with some insights. I will take probably, and I apologize for that, a minute or two to just describe our own offering in the field. I'll trim the marketing fluff to the barest minimum, and I'll keep it really short. Following that, I'll provide you with some resources and advice, and we'll free up time for a Q&A. You can start typing questions as we go on the chat box, and I'll provide a little bit more instructions towards the end, and we'll do our best to answer each and every question following the slides. And so with that, I want to stress the obvious, or maybe it's not that obvious. It's not obvious to some security practitioners, or at least, and that is that storage and backup are truly the last line of defense as it goes for planning for security incidents. And come to think of it, there is a gap in the industry, at least in the last few years. So the business value of data grows on and on. There is not a modern enterprise that can survive without its data, definitely in the financial services sectors and many, many others. And yet data-centered attacks are growing both in number and sophistications. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the surprising fact is that so many attacks succeed. There are stats that show that an alarming percentage of the attacks succeed, end up in paying the ransom, and in some cases, not being able to actually resume normal operations, recovering all the data. What does it tell us as the industry? So we'll try to visit that question as well. And data is the prime target. We mentioned that. An attack is not a question of if, but rather of when. At least you should assume that that's the case. When an attack occurs and your data is at rest, at the target, then the only chance to recover it, other than paying ransom, which is not always an option, is to recover it. When people think about backup, they often neglect to see the entire complexity in real life, because backup windows are scarce and restore speed unknown to people outside the storage discipline. Restores can be very lengthy at times. We rely on a tiered approach. Our tier 1 recovery option is from local and very quick copies like snapshots and point-in-time copies. And then we have replicated copies to environments that are either live or warm or can be spun up in the form of DR environments and recovery environments. And we have traditional and offsite backups and online backups and CDP systems that basically keep copies on a different format, either for short or long term, which take longer to recover. All of these are components of our backup and storage environment, and they are the only means to recover data at the end of the day, if all efforts fail. So let's revisit the threats then. I'm not going to cover all of those. I will point you out towards frameworks that have more thorough discussions of the different threats, but some of the most common ones are first and foremost data exfiltrations, which means a party that takes out some of your data out. There are many motivations. Many of those are monetary, but there are other motivations to influence your decisions or for political influences. When the data is out, of course, there are direct damages you should expect, either in the form of extortion or ransom demands, damage to reputation, and public image. There are significant fines in many industries and regions for organizations that fail to protect privileged information, and that's a growing concern. But there are also a lot of secondary damages that can occur. For example, mining the data can be used to harvest financial records that will allow attackers to compromise individual accounts, or to use them to plan future attacks, to compromise assets, to neutralize assets, to predict market sentiments, and to do other types of fraud. Another data-centered threat that's lurking out there, and it's very, very common in recent years, is ransomware and other forms of data destruction. So by the way, bear in mind, the intention of the attacker might not be just to lock your data for pay. If you take a look at an incident that happens around 2 years ago with an email provider called VF Email, for an unknown reason, at least it was never published, an adversary deleted millions of mailboxes, including all of the available disk-based recovery copies. There was no way to bring them back, and there was never a ransom demand. And you should expect those types of risk when you might be the target of a nation state or a hacktivist group or a terrorist group. So of course, there are developments and evolutions in that field. And the new norm today is that the attackers don't only go after your data, they also try and really successfully kill all of your backups. So groups like ReEvil and Conti and others are renowned for being very, very effective at hunting down all of those backups. We'll see a little bit more about that later. There are double extortions attacks where it's not only about locking your data for ransom, but also exfiltrating at least some of it with the threat of publishing it if you end up not paying, just in case you can still recover the data. So that's the threat of ransomware and the lockdown of your data. And there is also the risk of data alteration. Individuals or organizations might want to be able to alter your data without leaving trace, obviously in an unauthorized fashion, whether internal employees or external organizations. There are many, many motivations to modify your sensitive records. In many cases, to gain access to funds or create funds or commit fraud. But it can also be the threat or the reality of doing harm. Imagine a hospital and there is a patient that should go to surgery, and the medicine that should be administered has been tampered with. You don't really know what medicines to apply. That can be really life-threatening. Same goes for financial records and others. Just the sheer threat of being able to do that can force organization to pay significant damages. But data can be modified to influence entire ecosystems or even change governments or affect the way you take decisions, and the sky's the limit. It's something that's less thought of, but we have seen evidence that it's coming, right? One of the known forms is the supply chain attack. And we all remember the SolarWinds incidents where attackers chose, instead of exercising other forms of crime, to actually alter the victim's data in order to impact the entire ecosystem. In this case, the SolarWinds customers, which was, of course, much more profitable for them. So that's a huge concern, and the attack surface is large too much. We'll see that in a minute. But that begs the question, what does it all have to do with storage and backup? We are storage and backup professionals. When you talk to security or InfoSec admins, they'll usually think about doubling down on endpoint security and improving awareness training and utilizing more modern threat intelligence tools and introducing AI to detect patterns in the network or in the compute stack. So is it really relevant to storage? And my resigning answer, and of course you could have guessed that, is that yes, if your storage and backup infrastructure are insecure, that's actually a treasure trove to adversaries. And let's revisit the threats. In terms of data exfiltration, insecure storage and backup can help speed up the ability of individuals to take the data out of sight really quickly without being noticed. In fact, there was an interview with a hacker published a few months back, really, really illuminating, where they explained that modern cloud backup, so you can keep copies and offsite copies, and also introduce cloud-based media servers where you keep tertiary copies. This can be a threat, but also an opportunity. The hacker explained that if there is no sufficient segregation between duties and roles in production and DR, they can actually log in directly and impersonate a valid backup servers, and restore data to a new target they create directly off the cloud. So the actual activity of taking the data out of your sites occurs on the cloud provider's bandwidth, on the cloud provider's networks. It doesn't put any payload on your servers or network. If you are not logging things thoroughly enough, you probably won't notice. So it's not just a way of siphoning out huge amount of data, which is current. Yesterday's backup is as good as today's data for most cases, but also to exfiltrate data you didn't intend of being able to available publicly. So if your backup systems are vulnerable and I'm an attacker, I can alter the backup jobs to include sensitive data that you didn't include initially in that particular pool and get it out of the site. This is a very convenient way. There is a high trust between applications and their backup servers. So probably unless you're looking specifically for it, no one will notice. So securing your storage and backup is really important as a step to prevent exfiltration. And needless to say, DLP tools and others do not check for backup and backup traffic as far as I've ever seen. The next one is ransomware. Of course, that's obvious. We talked about the fact that storage and backups are the target of attacks to delete the backup copies, and you should be mindful of hardening those. And for data alteration, I will admit that there is not much evidence that attackers use the actual storage and backup plane to alter data. Rather, today they do it by compromising servers and endpoints and utilizing their access either to laterally to some are more privileged and then alter the data through the app server itself or the application itself or the service itself. But it can be done, and we have demonstrated it. And if you're interested, we'll be happy to share how it's sometimes much easier to alter data directly off the storage plane. So imagine that you have a large and sophisticated fabric with thousands of LUNs, and your management plane is not secured enough. And as a hacker, I have the opportunity to map a production LUN to an additional server I control somewhere. And I can try to orchestrate and synchronize writes directly underneath all the security layers and the agents you have installed on the network or on the server and tamper the data directly. So it's not that difficult to demonstrate how we can change individual records within a live database. You can tamper the backups and then zap a LUN to kill a server. The end user restores the data from backup. If I'm having control for the backup, I can tamper or poison the backup itself. Now you're restoring data that I have altered. So there are a lot of strategies to alter data directly through the data plane. It sounds like science fiction, but it's easy to do. And I think that if you run a sensitive organizations, you cannot ignore that option. In my personal view, these attacks are probably underway. So we can skip those details. You'll get a copy of the slide. As some intermediate conclusions and observations, storage and backup systems are possibly the only layer out there remaining for which there is no comprehensive vulnerability management solution in place in your own organizations. A lot of practitioners, whether from the InfoSec team or sometimes even the storage team, believe that the vulnerability management tools that are out there will also cover the storage OS. That's not the case. There is software all around your storage network, from the firmwares of the storage devices, of the fabric, of the switches. You have various software elements running sometimes on proprietary OSs and appliances. And these all have CVEs and vulnerabilities, which are currently not being checked by your existing vulnerability management tools. Likewise, many organizations, when being asked, find out that they don't have incident response plans for attacks on storage devices. And we'll see how easy it is to compromise. So if, as an attacker, I attack a block storage device, I can kill LUNs that serve thousands of servers, all in a single swoop. Do you know how to back up and restore for that particular eventuality? And finally, of course, as we've demonstrated, storage and backup should be hardened. Otherwise, they'll serve as a very, very large attack surface that will allow exploitation of those very same vulnerabilities and materialization of the very same threats. So with that, I want to move on to analyze the state of the industry and see if that's all theory and what's happening out there in reality. So late last year, we have published a survey, which you can find on the site, and I'll provide links towards the end, where we surveyed the state of storage security across a wide demographic. We analyzed more than 6,000 security incidents across a variety of vendors and industries across 5 continents. The results are not very promising. The average storage device, and by device I mean something like a switch, a virtualization appliance, a storage array, a file server, an object storage pool, or a bucket, things of that nature. So the average device will have 15 vulnerabilities, out of which 3 are either high or critical risk, which is really, really alarming. The survey doesn't really go through enumerating the risks and running stats. It also discusses some of the most common ones. We group them into 2 buckets. One are relatively common issues that you'll find in pretty much every environment we scanned. And the other are less common yet risks that you will find here and there and could be extremely lethal, and you should pay attention to those. So in the first category, you'll find issues like vulnerable protocols not being disabled by default or even actually used, like obviously SMB 1 or 1.1, which are completely prohibited for organizations who need to meet PCI standards. And maybe you don't even use them, but have they been disabled by default by your storage elements? And if not, can I, as a hacker, exploit them to gain access to shares you use with higher privileges? There are other protocols which are even less known, like NDMP and even SNMP and SMIS, that might be enabled, and they should be hardened. And they have versions that should be disabled. And a lot of organizations keep them open. That leaves a huge attack surface. I mentioned that earlier. There are a lot of CVEs and security bulletins around storage devices, which are not covered by your tools. And so it stands to reason that if we'll scan your environment, we will probably find devices which are not up to the right level, and they might be exposed to threat you're well familiar with, like Log4j. There are a lot of issues around access right restrictions, like objects, which can be mapped to servers or applications or users. They shouldn't. That's very, very common and hard to track. Even more frightening are insecure management and authentication. So you'll find a combination of horrible misconfigurations, which are still relatively common, like default users or factory default admin users that are provisioned with storage devices that have never been disabled. But even for those organizations who don't fall for that, you'll find lack of central management, the existence of shared accounts, lack of hardening. You'll find insecure session timeouts. You'll find that MFA hasn't been enabled for critical roles, and more user and access management and authentication settings that can be improved. And last but not least, even though it sounds very, very innocent, is lack of logging and insufficiently detailed logging. And that can be really, really lethal. Imagine that your backup systems are not logged. And as a hacker, I have the ability to alter the backup jobs. And for example, this can be used to kill even the most advanced and sophisticated backup mechanisms. So I'm just imagine that you have immutable storage in your environment. And this immutable storage is being used to protect critical data assets, and your backup tools will keep generations of data in the immutable storage. And as an attacker, I understand that I cannot delete them. I don't have enough access to sabotage those devices, but I can tamper with the backup jobs. So I can, for example, it's called poisoning. The strategy is called poisoning. I can poison future backups by having the backup job starting to back up meaningless data instead, either gradually or at once. So today's backup won't be any good, and tomorrow's won't be any good, and tomorrow's. And I just need to sit and wait for 30 or 60 or 90 days, and by which time I can finally encrypt the actual production data itself. Now you have facing the choice, you're facing the choice of either paying the ransom or going to your backup system to discover that you have no valid copies. The only valid copy you have is 90 days old. So will you lose 90 days worth of financial records or pay the ransom? Now, what stands between you and preventing this gap is time and the ability to detect the event by just logging things like unauthorized changes to critical backup jobs. That's something that's very, very easy to do. There are other lethal issues. I won't go into too much detail, but for example, licensed ransomware detection and prevention features that are never configured correctly, or that are configured but incorrectly, undocumented APIs. You should know that there are a lot of trust relationships, API endpoints, management consoles out there. Many of them are completely undocumented, or even control devices that can be mapped to servers, even sometimes DMZ servers. And if as a hacker, I recognize such an undocumented endpoint, I can utilize it to manage your storage. So for example, in one of the environments we scanned some time ago, we have found that there is a storage management console that was left after the testing period on a VM in the lab, and it has full privileges to manage production storage, but no one kept track of it for months. It was never patched, no one logged in. We managed to find out how to log in, and we could demonstrate that we were able to do anything we pretty much wanted on the production servers through that server. So undocumented and open management APIs and gateways and endpoints are significant concerns. And finally, oversights and vulnerabilities in the supply chain for the storage OS software itself, right? So we still found that it's not very common, but it does happen more often than you'd wish, where the auto-audit features of your devices, even in the back end, are left in power. There are no whitelisting of sites. There is no enforcement of authentication. And even if you download software and keep it on your own repositories, very few organizations check for signatures of software versions, and that could be a mess. And that begs the question, what can and what should we do now? So unsurprisingly, it all boils down to building a process. And I probably have to disappoint you in that respect, but it's not really different than any other security posture improvement initiative you might have had throughout the years. It starts with education, which means that you need to gather, first of all, a list of inventory. What do we have on the floor? What types of technologies? What types of versions? What's being used in which environment? And also knowledge. Educate both your InfoSec teams, because very often they're not familiar enough with the storage architecture, some of which is completely non-IP, and it's somewhat foreign to them. But even storage teams are not versed in security concepts. Gather the intel, close the knowledge gaps. It could be interesting to run a one-time scan of your environments with a trusted advisor, just to see what you're doing well and what you're not, to fill in the blanks. Then you probably need to analyze the relevant security frameworks. There is very good material coming up. ISO has published ISO 27040 in 2015, which is a very, very good resource, but it's being updated. There's a major update coming with more refined information. There is an equivalent guide that has been published by NIST, and there is plenty of amazing stuff on the SNIA side that can get you going and help you not only build an education plan, but also understand what types of security baselines you want to choose for your different application tiers. And that really needs to be defined. Once you have that in place, probably the next step will be to do a quick gap analysis and understand whether your actual inventory on the floor meets the requirements, close the gap, and finally build in automation, because storage systems are very, very volatile, contrary to the belief of some stakeholders in many organizations. The average lifespan of storage device is 3 to 5 years. You probably have dozens, hundreds, or even thousands, considering switches, ports, storage arrays, and so on. Provisioning is a matter of a daily basis. You have upgrades, you have migrations to cloud and from one device to another. Even if you have scanned your environment today and found it intact, you should be doing it regularly. And it's also a requirement for regulators who are tightening the requirements for control over storage security, data access security, and they start asking you to prove that you can demonstrate what's being backed up and how where it is stored and how well it is secured. So ongoing risk management can help you stay current, but also reduce the effort required with reporting and compliance. So I promise just to take maybe 2 to 3 minutes and talk about our offering. As a vendor, we have a technology called Storage Guard, which can automate a large portion of the process I've described. It is a completely agentless technology that can scan your infrastructure. Completely agentless, as I mentioned, it takes about 30 minutes to set up, and it can scan tens of thousands of storage devices and ports and tens of petabytes in a matter of minutes. What the product does is to collect the configuration details of your storage ecosystem and the security configuration details, and then analyze them to detect configuration risks based on the knowledge base I will describe in the next slide. It's an ongoing process that shows you the risk posture. It provides you with remediation guidelines, but also helps you to automate remediation of vulnerabilities that differ from your set baselines. And it helps you visualize and track your risk. The knowledge base I mentioned is fed from a variety of sources, and it's updated regularly. So you'll find automated checks, thousands of checks that are based on industry standards like ISO and NIST and CIS controls and others that we map to the individual platforms you will use, and which version, which type, and which model. It automatically checks vendor published best practices. So there are a lot of security advice by each vendor per platform, per version, which is relevant. And now you can have the ability to automatically check that you meet those requirements. We check for CVEs and vulnerabilities and recommended vendors hardening instructions that are published regularly. As I mentioned earlier, vulnerability management tools that you use today probably won't do that for you. And there is also a large body of knowledge that we accumulate by running discussions with hundreds of your peers. Many of them contribute advice and tell us what they do to improve storage security. So we turn those into a community feedback and recommendations. And by using Storage Guard, you can also understand how you stack up against your peers. Do you meet industry and end user community recommendations? I won't go over those slides, but the tool does provide you with everything you need to analyze and understand the risk posture from a geography standpoint, from a systems view, from an application view. And as you drill down into issues, it will show you both the relevant frameworks they relate to. It will explain the issue clearly. It will provide you with remediation advice, and it will help you automate the process of improving the security posture. So these were around 3 minutes about Storage Guard, and I promised I'll keep it brief. So just summing up what we've seen, there are a lot of resources on our site. So if you go to the resources section at www.continuitysoftware.com, you'll find the survey I've mentioned, plus additional surveys around trends in the CISO landscape, in the security teams, white papers, a collection of resources and links for regulation and standards, and educational pieces that we publish regularly. I also mentioned our product. You can sign up if there is any interest to a free trial, which, even though it's limited in scope, can allow you to extremely quickly scan a portion of your environment and get a feel into how mature you are. So that's something we'll be very happy to do. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out either through the site or through our contact details. And with that, and before clearing the stage to a Q&A, you can definitely, if you haven't done so already, start typing in your questions. We'll be very, very happy to take them. And as soon as I'll wrap up these slides, we'll start answering the questions. If there is anything we won't be able to answer within the time limits of this session, rest assured we'll do our best to reach out later and provide you with the answers offline. And finally, at the end of this session, we'll be very, very happy if you take a moment to rate this session. And so with that, I want to really thank you for your time, and I'll now go ahead and start addressing your questions. Thank you very much.